So with that, I'll turn over the floor to Kevin Bott.
Thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Kevin Bott. Since it's a small, well first thanks for coming out on kind of a dreary Friday afternoon. But since we are a small group, I wonder if we could just go around and say, if you could all say who you are and where you're coming from.
Hi, my name is Melanie, and I'm a first-year linguistics student in the master's program.
In the master's program, great. Hi.
Sorry.
Do you want me to wait? I'll come this way.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
I'm also a physics student, and this is my second year, and I'm a master's
Master's.
and my name is Sin.
Sin.
Yes. I'm Janine, I'm a third-year PhD student in English education.
Oh, great. Hi.
Oh, I'm Yuan, CIP Cultural Foundation Association. I'm writing
Professor.
dissertation.
Are you writing a dissertation?
Hi, I'm Alicia. I'm a master's student in media studies, second year, going into a PhD next year.
Here.
No.
Where are you going?
I'm not sure yet. Deciding.
Okay, great.
So,
Hi.
Hello, I am Matthew, and I am a student in the Library and Information.
Great, welcome. We're just introducing ourselves and saying what program we're in.
PhD in civil engineering from analysis to skill function. And this is my final
It's a graduate program? Master's program?
PhD.
PhD? Oh, great. Congratulations. Oh, what's your name?
When
Wayne. Hi.
What's up, Kevin?
Hi, Kyle.
I'm Kyle, and I'm a graduate student here. That's what I'm doing in Cultural Foundation of Disability Studies.
Great. Hi.
I'm Brett, first year doctoral student, special education disability studies.
Great. So I am not faculty here. I adjunct in the drama department, but my primary, quite a month or spent on this. My primary job is as the associate director of, as Glenn mentioned, a national consortium called Imagining America: Artists and Scholars in Public Life. Maybe some of you have had some interaction with that organization over the years. We've been here now for a little over 5 years. We're just next door in the Tolley building. And we're a national consortium of about 90 or so colleges and universities that are very interested in, I guess in a nutshell, reasserting and reclaiming the democratic and civic purposes of higher education. And we're primarily interested in the ways that artists and humanities scholars and designers are able to do work that's grounded primarily in partnership outside of the academy, so with community partners and community defined as anything from individual community members to foundations and policymakers and everything in between, cultural, nonprofit organizations, what have you. But today, I'm going to talk about action research. A lot of work that's done in community and even within organizations undertakes action research as a methodology. And so I'm going to go through some of the salient aspects. Obviously, this isn't going to be terribly in-depth in an hour, plus hopefully some discussion. But I will say that when I was a doctoral student, I studied at NYU. I just defended now, I guess, 3 years ago. I was doing community-based art theater work. And, you know, as folks know who are writing theses or dissertations, the key to success, which I found to be true, was making sure that you had both a topic and I think a process that was going to keep you engaged for the long haul, because it is a long haul, even when it's relatively short, like 4 or 5 years, if you can believe that's relatively short. It's it's an intense, long slog to basically write a book about a very specific slice of work you're doing. And as it was natural for me to first go toward qualitative research because it's arts-based. My PhD is in educational theater, so in both education and in theater, qualitative research would be a natural fit. But then when one of the interesting ways I got into action research is because as a political theater scholar, I was beginning to study the work of Paulo Freire, who, if you don't know, was a liberation pedagogue from Brazil who was himself creating and implementing action research projects in rural Brazil as a way to teach literacy to peasants. And not just to teach literacy because it's good for people to know how to read, but because, Freire understood that reading, being able to read the world and reading in a broad definition, how do we read the word world culturally and not just through text, but the ability to read the world is the first step in an ability to transform the world. And so a reading of Freire eventually leads you to the idea of something called participatory action research, or PAR, which is really one of the forms of action research, and I'll go through this, kind of the spectrum of action research, but that's really concerned with transformation in a way that speaks to social justice concerns. So let's just talk about what action research is. And I guess to talk about what action research is to talk about why it's still greeted with some skepticism in the academy, because it does take a different kind of stance than traditional methodologies, positivist methodologies. Certainly it's a counter approach to positivist methodologies. And so the two primary things that I want to focus on is the locus of control and the focus on transformation. So with all action research, of course, whether we're talking about quantitative or qualitative, positivistic or naturalistic inquiry, and I'm just going to assume that you've all taken some methodology courses, so I won't go into the background of positivism and naturalism and all of that. But to say that any kind of traditional research is interested in objectivity. How can we know truth if we're not sufficiently removed from the subject under study? Action research takes an opposite approach and says that the locus of control for the research is actually grounded with what we would have called subjects, but in this case we would call participants or stakeholders. So from the design, from even the identifying the problems that we would seek to inquire about, all the way through the analysis of the data, it's held in some regard with the subjects, with the participants. And that can take a number of different definitions depending on what kind of action research it is, and we'll get to that in a moment. And then, as I alluded to earlier, there is a focus on transformation. You're engaging in action research. The action suggests that the researcher or researchers have identified something that needs changing. And that could be one's own personal practice within a setting, or organizational setting, or an educational setting of practice, public health and nursing, engage in a lot of action research, principals and teachers in school settings are doing a lot of action research. And the idea is that they've identified something by being in the context of their own either employment or for why they're in that setting, I don't know, but they've identified something that they think could be improved upon and they want to study it. And so those are the two primary ways that action research differs. So as I said, it's grounded in a particular local context. It emerges from one's own experience or knowledge. I'll speak primarily about the world of education because that's how I approached my action research. I probably should say something about my own dissertation in a second. It's inductive typically rather than deductive in that you're using specific examples to make broader generalizations rather than starting with theory and bringing it down to the level of how it might apply to specific instances. It's the other way around. And again, you're seeking to understand and to change something. And importantly, action research is meant to feed knowledge back into the local setting. It's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. The knowledge that you're generating is meant to go right back into the local settings. And when we get to a discussion about validity, trustworthiness, this becomes really important because one of the ways that action research is judged is on how successful it is in, first of all, feeding back into the local setting to change something, and by whose standards, not simply by my standards as the university-based researcher, but certainly by the local stakeholders who also have something to gain through the knowledge creation. So I'll just pause for a second and just tell you, I was working, just to tell you what my dissertation was about, I was working in prisons downstate near New York City, doing theater productions. As I got into writing my dissertation, I was working with a population of re-entering men coming back from prison into their communities in New York. And I just became really enamored with the idea of solving a problem. There were no arts-based programs for people coming back from prison, but there was a lot of criminological and sociological literature about the potential for particularly ritual and rites of passage to have an impact on re-entry. This is a long aside, but I'll just say that 95% of the 2 million plus individuals who go into prison each year, 95% of those people will come back into society, and about 2/3 of everyone who comes back to society fails. About 2/3 wind up either getting busted on a parole violation or being rearrested on a new charge. So there's a real issue in reentry. Of course, as an artist and educator, it was clear that arts hadn't been tried as a possible approach to mitigating some of the failures in reentry. And so I thought, what could I develop as an arts facilitator with a local population to understand this problem better and maybe to make some interventions that succeed. So this is, if you Google action research cycle or action research spiral images, you'll find a million variations of this diagram. This is one of the first ones. Stephen Kemmis developed this, and this is how action research operates, and it's also why a lot of people avoid action research. Because it's a messy process. It's not a linear process. It's a cyclical process. But the basic action research spiral that people engage in is planning, acting. I usually hear observe and evaluate to start again and continuing through that cycle. So I'll just use the most typical version of action research, one of the most typical versions of action research. Let's say I'm a principal in a high school, and I'm really aware that there's something amiss with my leadership style. I don't know what it is, but I don't seem to connect with any of my faculty. It's just not working out. So I develop a hypothesis and think, all right, I'm gonna do something differently. And then I put it into action. I mean, just very simply. I'm gonna bring cookies on Friday. That's my initial plan. So Friday comes, I bring cookies, kind of check out. I'm monitoring now how's the faculty responding to the chocolate chip cookies that I brought in. Not so great. Didn't work out as well as I thought. Mary was happy, but nobody else seemed to care about the cookies. So I've evaluated that. Let me go home this weekend and figure out something else. Maybe I need to bring in more than just chocolate chip. Maybe that was my problem. I'm going to do chocolate chip and oatmeal, and I'm also going to bring in some whole milk and some almond milk. Make sure maybe that was it. So yeah, you get it. So you go along. Finally, you figure out, well, cookies wasn't it at all. I'm getting away from cookies. Maybe I need to have more in-service days, and you go through it. And that's what you're doing through the whole thing. Continually revising your plan, acting on it, seeing how it works out, evaluating, etc. So that example of the principle is the first scale of action research. Well, let's see if I put this in the right order here. Yeah, perfect. Which is an insider action research study. It's where one person is studying themselves or their own practice in their setting. I would say for a dissertation or a thesis, this is probably the least complicated form of action research that you're going to undertake, because it's the closely aligned to how dissertations and theses work, which is as an individual exercise. Much of this work is collaborative, and when you're asked by most committee members to write a dissertation, you're being asked to write a monograph, and you're being judged on your singular ability to conduct an extended research project and to collect data, analyze that data, make some inferences from the data. This is also, I think, great for what we find a lot in graduate school now, which is people who are working people. Not everyone is a full-time student. This worked for me because this was the work I was doing. I was already doing my work with reentry populations. If you're a principal or you're a teacher who's trying to get an advanced degree, but you're not leaving your full-time job, rather than find a topic that's something else, another piece of work that you have to engage in, this allows you to use your site that you're going to every day as your site of research. It can also get really messy to do that as well, because you're having to kind of separate your life. There's your regular practice. You need to be keeping tabs and collecting data of things that you normally take for granted. So we'll move down the scale here. This kind of work you do see in schools, you see in hospitals, you see in organizations. People inside of an organization working with other people inside of the organization. Maybe it's a nonprofit organization and there are ways that democratic practice could be improved. And so you're going to start from the very beginning by identifying problems together, setting out to understand a particular set of questions, determining what actions you're going to take. You're never leaving that spiral, of course, but you're doing it collaboratively. Insiders in collaboration with outsiders. So this one's a little bit more rare. It really means that people within a particular organization are going to reach out, maybe to someone within the academy, maybe to a consultancy organization that has research skills, but it's going to be the insiders that invite the outsiders. Now, as you all probably know, when it comes to research, and especially academic research, it's usually the academics who are reaching out to partners outside of the academy and saying, I think you'd make a great site for some research, or is there something I can do to help you? In this case, it's the insiders reaching out to outsiders. I don't know of many instances personally where that happens, but there's plenty of literature about that. This more gets into participatory action research. Insider-outsider teams is a great example of the kind of work that Paulo Freire did that I mentioned before. And they don't require too much more explanation than what's just stated here. But this is a good example of how community-based research, community-based arts, any community-based scholarship and action that you see happening around the city of Syracuse is folks within an organization bringing in faculty and students and staff from the university or again from other professional organizations to work together on a given issue. And this is just the inverse of this one. This is what I mentioned before, that people from the outside are, the first position of this just indicates who's making the first move. The one thing I want to mention about the insider studying themselves or their own practice, one of the things that happens pretty typically with dissertations is a committee will see someone wanting to study their own setting, and they'll encourage the student to treat the practice as the field, so in traditional qualitative parlance, as the field, and removes the insider from the locus of investigation. And they try to kind of trick themselves into pretending that they actually don't work there or don't belong as part of that setting or organization. It's called outsider within. You're within the setting, but you're trying to pretend you're an outsider to it. And when you do that, you're ignoring some of the central tenets of action research, which is the necessity of foregrounding all of your own biases and all of the taken for granted aspects of the work you're doing in the setting. So that's just something to be aware of. I'll see people saying something is qualitative research, and you look closely and say, this is actually someone studying their setting, and I think it actually obliterates any claim to validity if you're going to do that. This is a terrible slide. Oh, it's actually better on there than it was. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention, kind of related to that, this is a great, for those of you who are interested, the Action Research Dissertation is a slim book written by a husband and wife team, Catherine Herr and Gary Anderson. It's really useful as you're getting started down this. But again, this just takes you on what I think of as an ethical scale, where you're doing research on people, which is a pretty traditional stance. And that's their mode of participation, co-option. And going down to compliance, you're leading it, but you're really just assigning tasks. You're deciding the agenda, so you're doing the research for them. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's the agreed upon setup when you're going into it. And then it gets more democratic as you go down. Consulting, for and with, cooperation, you're doing it with. And here the power is starting to tilt toward the insiders to the organization. You're co-learning, you're acknowledging the knowledge that's held by the local community, not by so-called experts. So you're doing it with them, but it's also being done by the stakeholders. And then collective action is when there's really no outsiders at all. Everyone sees themselves as inside the project. As you get into these, and why I would never recommend some of these for a dissertation, is that most of us come into an institution as grad students not having lived in the city or the town before. You're building new relationships. All of this work is built on relationships. If you're engaged in a participatory action research model, that can take up to 10 years to really do. I mean, when you read models of that work, it's a decade-long investment if you're starting from just getting to know stakeholders on the inside of an organization or institution. I'm strongly in favor of people writing this thing quickly and moving on with their lives. So validity is a term that comes from positivism. Trustworthiness is something you hear in qualitative research. And the question is, how do we know that the the data analysis is legitimate. And just as qualitative research challenged the supremacy of positivism by saying there are other ways of understanding truth that aren't just based, it's not everything is propositional knowledge where you can state declaratively this is true. Naturalist inquiry, qualitative inquiry, muddies those waters by acknowledging that there are many truths, there are many truth holders, and that you have to somehow triangulate between a lot of different sources and data collection methods to get to something that resembles what's happening amongst a certain group of people or within a particular setting. So in the same sense, action research is asking for or is asserting another set of validity criteria. So I'll start by saying, what are the 5 goals of action research? Again, this is taken by her and Anderson's the action research dissertation book that I mentioned. Generation of new knowledge, achievement of action-oriented outcomes. Does the research move the group toward action, towards change, action? Generation of new knowledge, of course, is the goal of all dissertations. That's what we're all hoping to do. That learning is happening, education is happening by both the researchers and the participants. The results, as I said before, are relevant to the local setting, and that you have a sound and appropriate research methodology. And this is where you're going to have the most trouble with the committee. Now, I think we've said that there may not be an action research course here. Is that true? No. There's not, right? Right, so.
That's why I got you.
Yeah. I have to start one. But this, if there's no course here at SU right now, you might run into trouble trying to form a committee who is receptive to doing something like this. I will say that I called IRB this week to see, sometimes you have problems with IRB because they also can't quite understand how someone who's embedded in the setting is able to protect the research participants. And so I wrote an email to Kathleen King, who's the head of IRB, and I said, do you get a lot of action research proposals? And if so, how does the IRB committee treat them? Are they scrutinized with any more rigor than anything else? Well, her first email back to me was, what exactly is action research? So that's never a good sign. But the follow-up conversation, was really encouraging, and I actually sat on this IRB for a little while. They're actually they're very good IRB, and their concerns are really around whether you're protecting the people that you're working with if you're using human subjects. And so what Kathleen said about this is, this is an academic question to her. She doesn't care. She is not looking to see if you have a sound and appropriate research methodology, but certainly your committee will. Gary Anderson, the author of this book, was on my committee, luckily. So, I can remember in the writing stage, there were 11 p.m. calls to Gary's house because I was struggling through an issue. It helps to have an action research practitioner on your committee, or at least as an outside reader and a consultant, so that you have some backup when you're trying to figure some things out or make a case for the rest of your committees. If your chair is not flexible, if your chair needs to be if your committee chair is very particular and doesn't agree with action research or doesn't understand it, I would steer clear or get a new chair. It's not worth it. So there are corresponding. Again, I'm using all of this from her and Anderson, so you can see this in a more expansive form in that book. But Gary and Kathleen came up with 5 different types of validity to correspond with the 5 goals of action research. So I'm just going to go through them really quickly. Action research is all about process. So the validity markers that you're checking against when you're talking about the first goal, the generation of new knowledge, has to do with what they call process validity. Do the findings emerge through the action research cycles? Was the process sound and appropriate that resulted in the findings that I articulate at the end of my study? Importantly, are the cycles challenging underlying assumptions? So again, you're in some respect on the inside of the practice. I really encourage people who are doing this work, especially the insider action research, to read the work of Donald Schoen, who's a Harvard scholar, S-C-H-O-N. He wrote a very famous book called The Reflective Practitioner, and it's all about how teachers, artists, professionals, it was really about professionals, it was about architects, doctors, what are the ways that we practice that are taken for granted? So in my case, as an artist working with a population to create original theater, what have I done for 40 years of my life that I don't even think about anymore? I have to bring those things to my consciousness because those are my underlying assumptions. I have assumptions about my practice. I have assumptions about the field that I'm in, and the cycle should always be asking questions about that. And I mentioned triangulation before. Triangulation is just a way to make sure that you have enough sources, enough methods, so that you're not, you can't, for example, if you're doing interview-based research, you can't just do an interview with a person and assume, then say that what that person said is true. You'd have to check that person's account through a number of other different kinds of sources, including your own observation. So again, these are pretty standard, is the process being used. This is very briefly, the fifth type of validity is dialogic validity, and this really refers to the fact that because action research is a fairly specialized methodological approach, that a lot of folks in action research suggest and really feel strongly that researchers should be in a constant process of dialogue with other action researchers, so that you can check your ethic, can check your methods, that you're not just doing this on your own. And that's probably a good thing to do no matter what your methodology is to have study groups and people that you're working with to check if what you're thinking in your head actually makes sense to people in the real world. Achievement of action-oriented outcomes. So outcome validity. It's not enough just to generate knowledge, as I said before. You want this research to be successful, so that you're moving towards something that benefits all of the stakeholders. And the question is, who's it successful for? It may be successful for you as a doctoral or a master's student, but if it's not improving in the view of the subjects, of the participants of the study, if it's not beneficial to them, it's not really a successful study. And another thing about action research, it's not just trying to solve a problem. The purpose of the cycles and the questioning the underlying assumptions should be leading to more questions and to more complexity. This is happening in professional and social realms, so you're not getting to an endpoint and saying, okay, I figured out this issue. If this is something that's going to become your work in academia or whatever realm you wind up working in, you can look at your dissertation or your thesis as the end of one large action cycle that you're going to then get to the end to and say, oh, this is what I discovered. Now, when I'm out of this dissertation hell and I get a job somewhere, I'm going to start again from that point, and now I'm going to begin a cycle, hopefully with some funding. Catalytic validity. How is what's happening in the process of action research catalyzing and energizing participants? Let's just read Patty Lather's quote: "The degree to which the research process reorients, focuses, and energizes participants toward knowing reality in order to transform it." Now, you could read that in terms of social justice. I certainly did when I was working with people coming out of prison. One of my goals was that the research process would energize participants into kind of a social, structural view of their reality in order to transform some of the mechanisms of prison reentry. But I mean, you could bring that down to a much more practical realm and say, you know, we want nurses and doctors to understand what's working and what's not working in the hospital, so that we can transform this to make it a more humane place for our patients, for whatever the setting is. You can transfer that. So that's pretty clear, I think. Democratic validity sort of refers back to what we were talking about before. Just again, how collaboratively are you working with the stakeholders? Of course, when you're writing a thesis, it's natural that you get tunnel vision, and it's easy to start cutting corners because you want to get through it, and it's time to analyze, and maybe you are out of the setting. In my case, you know, it's a 12-week theater project, and I was working very closely in those 12 weeks with the stakeholders. But it would be very easy after the 12 weeks to just go on and write my findings, analyze it myself, not ask for feedback. So you want to have some standard for yourself and some proof in your dissertation when you're writing your chapter on trustworthiness or validity, about how ethical you were in this process and how deep your concern was for the outcomes affecting all of the stakeholders and not just your own PhD or master's degree. And again, local is another way of talking about democratic validity, the local validity, the extent to which problems emerge from local settings, and that the outcomes are relevant to the local settings. So again, one of the reasons this is tricky in academia is because your mentors, by and large, are concerned about the relevance of the knowledge you've generated for the field, whatever the field is. You know, it's a universal kind of knowledge generation. You'll hear people talk about how generalizable is the knowledge that you generated. So action research isn't really concerned with knowledge being able to be generalized beyond the local setting. It's for the local setting, and I'll get to that in just a minute, but this is one of the reasons that you're going to run into trouble with mentors and committee members. And finally, that this is true of any kind of research, that you have a sound and appropriate methodology. The action research spiral or cycle is the primary methodology that you're engaging with. So your findings need to emerge as a result of going through a series of cycles. Are we challenging the underlying assumptions, as we said before? So this is the same thing, right? I'm saying the same thing. This is the same thing. You're using the same process validity for your fifth outcome. So number 1 and number 5 are the same. You're using process validity. The difference is with number 1, with the generation of new knowledge, you're using dialogic validity. You're not going to use that for your methodology. So again, your methodology, and is everyone clear? I'll just assume maybe everyone's not clear about methods and methodologies, because I know that's easy to get confused. But briefly, just to say, methodology is the organizing framework for the research. Methods are the things you're doing within a methodology. So methods are, how you're collecting data, interviews, observations, keeping your field log, research or journal, all of that thing. A methodology is really qualitative, quantitative, the epistemological framework. Just a couple of bullet points. This is really the end of the presentation. Are just some things to think about. I've already talked about committee and possible hurdles you might have to overcome when selecting a committee. I just think it's good if you start walking down this road, especially for folks who are, know that they're coming in, say you're in education and you're going for your advanced degree or nursing or whatever the case is. If you're a working person and you know that you're going to be looking to do action research, I think you just need to talk to your potential, well, first of all, talk to your chair. And if they don't know what it is, that you need to be ready to make a case for why action research is appropriate, and make sure that they see that all of their concerns about trustworthiness, about your ability to remain objective are answered. And the answer to that last thing is that you won't be objective. That's not the point of action research. It takes into account the fact that you can't be objective. The proposal is a little bit different from other kinds of research. Your proposal for an action research dissertation is really your best guess about what might happen in the field. It's your first plan, but you have no idea what's going to happen in the field. Or you might be, maybe it's better to say you're going to be surprised by what happens in the field. And so again, you're looking for a committee that recognizes that action research is an evolutionary process. You're changing things as you're going. It really helps to do some sort of pilot work for an action research project. The thing about action research, and I found this even when I was writing, especially when I was writing, I guess, is that it's really messy. It's really ambiguous. You have to have a personality that can deal with ambiguity and messiness, because there's nothing linear about it. There's nothing clear cut about what you're finding. You're going to have a ton, as with any qualitative research, you're going to have a ton of data. My log, now I videotaped 20 hours of class sessions and transcribed all of my notes from that. I was keeping a weekly journal on what was happening. Of course, if you're a practitioner doing insider action research, you're not able to take notes in the moment of practice. So unlike qualitative research, where you might be in the corner watching a teacher teach, taking notes as you're observing, if you're an insider practitioner researcher, you're not doing that. You have to go home at the end of the day and recall, and in the moment have another part of your mind kind of thinking, oh, I need to remember this, I need to remember this. Maybe have a little thing where you can jot something down. My final logbook that I used for my analysis was over 500 pages long, just of straight transcription and journal entries. So you have to be willing to deal and wade into a big pile of mess. And that's why I say the pilot is important, because do a pilot where the stakes are not very high, and you can sort of figure out if this is for you, and make a lot of mistakes along the way. See just how difficult it is to keep your role straight. You have your role as the researcher, you have your role as a stakeholder ally, you have your stake perhaps as a professional or a volunteer within a particular setting. A lot of times the pilot stage is difficult to identify, because you may be doing a form of action research sort of unconsciously. If you're a professional in a practice, you might be implementing things just as part of what we all do in a job. Hopefully, is like, how can I get better at what I'm doing? Let me try this organizational strategy and see if it works. So sometimes and if, let's just say, why the pilot can also get messy is when you start a dissertation or a thesis, if you've already been in the practice and you've already been kind of working on some problems, where does the first cycle start? When do you identify the beginning of the first action cycle for the actual monograph that you're going to write? So that's just something to consider. And it might happen in a prologue or a first chapter of your dissertation to say, this is how I got to what I'm considering the start of this piece of research. In some ways, this is action cycle number 4, but I feel like I have a more concrete idea of how to implement a strategy now. Your research questions, this relates to your proposal, they'll evolve, just as your methodology will evolve while you're in the field. The questions that I wrote in my topic proposal and my dissertation proposal have nothing to do with the questions that I stated in my dissertation. I mean, they have something to do with it, it's the same topic. But it's not what I told my committee or the audience that came to see my dissertation proposal presentation. They're not the same questions. And the reason for that is that I was surprised in the study that something else emerged that was of great interest to me. And because I had an action research person on my committee, I had some backup to say, well, we need to be flexible here. This really interesting agenda item came up in the course of the study, and Kevin wants to go in that direction. Let's let him do that. And that was really important to have that kind of backup. The methodology, the same thing. You're going to discover things after your first cycle, to use the very silly cookie example before, you might get to cycle 2 and say, oh my gosh, my whole approach to what I'm thinking is going to create positive change in the setting is totally off. It has nothing to do with cookies. It has nothing to, I might have gotten in there and said, this approach to theater that I'm using is actually counterproductive and I need to change the whole thing. I can't just jump ship and abandon the people I invited into the project. That wouldn't be ethical. But in cycle 3, I might need to change the whole approach, hopefully in collaboration with the participants. I mentioned just clarity and multiple roles, just things to think about, that you're going to be playing, wearing different hats in the setting, because in some way, even if you start as an outsider working with insiders, your positionality is going to get blurry at some point. In terms of your findings, it's different from it. Like I said before, it's not about propositional truth. It's not about saying you've discovered something. The end of a successful action research project should end with having learned something about the subject of inquiry. It should lead to a series of more complex questions about the subject, a more complex understanding about the subject, and importantly, the findings should point toward action and suggested steps that you and the other researchers / participants can take. So this refers back to those questions of validity. But it's not going to be the same as saying, basically I discovered this truth and this truth and this truth. This is how I answered those questions. It's that the questions that you say on page 10 of your dissertation lead you on a journey that gets you to a much deeper complexity when you're at page 300 talking about what you've discovered. So you might change that idea of findings to discoveries. And then I just wanted to mention about the defense. A lot of people really support the idea of inviting the other stakeholders to your defense if you have to do a defense and if you're able to do a public defense. I was bummed out that I wasn't given the option of doing a public defense. Mine was just my outside readers and my committee and myself. But I think it's important as part of, it's not going to be included in your written artifact, but to have folks at the defense who can support what you're saying is perhaps an aspect of the trustworthiness of what you found. People have been known to stand up in defense of doctoral candidates who are getting a harsh grilling by community stakeholders saying, you're characterizing this all wrong. This isn't what happened. This was our ally, so I don't know if that's going to win the day, but it's nice to have. And then I just wanted to offer a couple of resources for you. These are some of the ones that I just used to make this presentation and that I relied heavily on when I was writing my own dissertation. And these are just some other names that you should know if you get into this. And there are a lot of different approaches to, and a lot of different contexts for action research, from corporate, trying to figure out how to make a business or a corporation more efficient in terms of profits, to this more liberation, participatory action research that I talked about with Freire. So I recommend some of these, like the Action Research Read or the Action Research Dissertation, and they'll talk about, those books will talk about, if you're doing work in a professional organizational setting, these are the people you want to read. That's my spiel. That's all I got for you. Any thoughts or questions or comments? Yeah, please.
Yes, I was actually working on my methodology chapter, and it's kind of refreshing, informative to listen to your presentation. I'm just wondering, you talked about the insider without, outsider within, this positionality. In relation to your own dissertation research, do you have, I'm sure you have tons of stories to share, but you maybe cite one or two examples of stories to address this positionality, subjectivities.
Yeah, well, I found it to be the most confusing part of, it was really hard for me at first, and I have to actually try to think about now what was so confusing about it, but it was hard for me to locate. So I was a PhD student who was going, well, let's say that I wasn't even going into a setting. I was creating a program. So I was inviting men who had come out of prison to participate in a program that I developed. And so I was asking myself, well, I'm an outsider to the reentry population, but I'm an insider to the practice, into the program. We're all insiders. Everyone who's participating is an insider in the actual program I developed. So how should I frame my work? Am I an insider or am I an outsider? I wasn't sure about that. What I wound up doing, I initially, and this is true for a lot of at least the people I was going to school with. I was in a political theater program, so a lot of people were concerned with social justice, doing research that was aimed toward a more just and equitable society. So everybody thinks, I want to do participatory action research. I want to work in close collaboration with participants so that we're agreeing on our goals and how to analyze this. That became really complicated because, of course, then you're also asking people to take on a lot of work for, in my case, what are the men getting out of the hours and hours they would have to spend to learn how to analyze data, to come up with questions. So I just wasn't sure how to position myself. At the end of the day, and this changed once I got into the setting, I was an insider to my own practice. That's what I wound up studying, was my own facilitating practice. So in my dissertation, I wrote about, there were a couple of scales of cycles that were happening. There were the cycles of the actual theater program, which was a pilot theater program. I was attempting to use a particular approach to theater making to help these particular individuals have a better outcome for action research. So week to week, I was engaging in a plan, act, reflect, evaluate cycle. What just happened when I did that theater exercise? How did the men respond to it? What was the outcome for it? What should I do next week? So that was one iterative process. But the focus of, and I wrote about that in my dissertation, that was one level of what I was writing about. The primary focus of my dissertation was in thinking about my own ethical decision-making practice. And so I was relying a lot on Donald Schoen's work, the reflective practitioner work, which is how do I, as a practitioner, as an educator, do my work in ways that are taken for granted? What am I discovering when I surface those taken for granted aspects of my work? And so that's how I position myself, as an insider to my own practice, with the goal of improving my own practice. Now, as one outcome to this, there was the work that was being done, and I see that as part of that larger cycle. Like my dissertation is the end of one cycle, and I'm now looking for funding with the local group here in Syracuse to now get funding to now do the second round of a cycle to experiment with how this theater method might improve outcomes for reentry people. But I had to get really narrow about my focus so that I was the one that I was seeking to have it was only myself that I could claim was being changed or catalyzed toward change. I didn't want to go very far with making any broader claims for the men. Is anyone, I mean, is this brand new to most of you, just the action research?
We don't have an independent course on action research, but it's actually an important subject in the qualitative research courses offered both in sociology and cultural foundation
Sure.
education.
Yeah, sociology uses action
Yeah.
research quite a lot. Anything else people are thinking about?
You were talking about wearing different hats and kind of in your own mind, sort of divvying up these roles, researcher kind of being one of them. At the same time that you're talking about action research as sort of deliberately kind of erasing that distinction in certain ways. Is that something that you have to work through too? I mean, how do you, are you just taking something and from the macro level and then sort of talking about it happening inside your head, or how is it different as the researcher versus?
So like in comparison to say like qualitative research where you're going into the field and doing participant observation and interviews and that sort of thing? I mean, are you?
Well, there the focus is on, I mean, you are just a researcher.
That's right.
And if
right,
you're not
exactly.
the researcher, then there's a problem.
Exactly.
So if you're the participant researcher, but
Yes.
you still have that researcher role inside your head,
Yeah.
after you've officially erased it in terms of your own role,
Yeah.
how does that? I'm not sure I've got a real
Yeah.
question there, but it seems like there's kind of there's still that idea of the independent observer researcher
Yeah.
is still kind of it's somehow internalized.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think part of that is in making sure that you, and I think, you know, a lot of, I didn't mention this, but something that really typifies action research in the writing about it is the autobiographical aspect of it. It's really important that the researcher is engaged in a continual kind of investigation about their stance and their understanding of what they're studying. And I think just the idea of being explicit both to yourself but also to the other participants. I was always clear with the participants of the program that I was both the theater facilitator and I was trying to understand what was happening, and that when I was asking them to complete assignments or I was interviewing them, that I was researching. And, you know, of course, I mean, that's explicit because you have to get them to sign IRB consent forms, and, you know, they're going into it with clarity. I think more of the confusion comes when you have to narrow your focus to your dissertation, so that otherwise your dissertation can be 10,000 pages long. I mean, you're talking about a huge aspect of your life, and as any good dissertation advisor is going to tell you, you want to get as narrow a sliver of what's happening in a given setting as you can, because even that narrow sliver is going to come out to 300 pages long if you're doing your work in a rigorous way. So yeah, the confusion was always coming around to, what piece of this am I looking at, and from what perspective? As a theater practitioner, I have one set of concerns. I need the theater piece to be successful. That's an important aspect for my stakeholders, because I don't want them to be embarrassed when they're presenting this in front of their family at the end of the 3-week process. So I have that great concern. That could be one aspect of what I'm studying, but it wasn't. I mentioned it, of course. It's part of what was happening in the site. And in fact, I brought that particular aspect in because I felt that it was an ethical consideration, that I've invited these people in, I've asked them to become very vulnerable, to do something in a public forum, and so because I was looking at my own ethics within the practice, that was something I looked at. Just as you don't know if you had a question, I don't know if I have an answer, but I guess I'll stop right at that moment. Yeah.
You're talking about generalizability, and you mentioned you did your work in New York City, and now you're looking to do work here. Obviously, there's some components that are going to be transferred from that setting over here.
Yeah.
I'm looking at doing work. I've done some work in Western Kenya on how to make things more accessible for schooling for disabilities. And I'd like to be able to take that and do like a career path to other countries that might have limited resources in terms of education. So I'm just curious if you maybe elaborate a little bit more about generalizability. It is something that I'm interested in order to replicate certain parts. I mean, not exactly, because I know that's the nature of.
So can you tell me some of your work in Kenya, what you did?
Yeah, well, I've done work in Bahrain as well, and looking specifically at creating an action plan. So what are some barriers to inclusive education, and what can we do as a team, as an education team of stakeholders, to make things more accessible for kids with disabilities? And so I took some of those aspects, kind of an action plan meeting, looking at those barriers and successes to it, and then replicated that again.
With local teachers, administrators.
Yeah, and then I took those, and I generalized that from my practice as a teacher in California. Started there in elementary school, generalized that over to parts of it, to the Middle East, and then took some of that into another region in Western Kenya, and did similar type of work, obviously in a totally different context, but the same type of, what do we have here? What are the successes and challenges of the education system? And so, drawn from each setting that I've been in, and it's worked to a certain degree in every setting.
Yeah.
But it's not the exact same thing.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But it is generalizable.
And I think there are aspects of that kind of work that is going to be transferable. I mean, you're dealing with similar populations, so you can bring that work over. What people have concerns about in insider practitioner research, or even team research, insider outsider team research, is that the work is so focused on a particular organizational problem that someone's confronting, that it's only going to have use in the local setting. I mean, you're already engaged in a kind of action research spiral. You've done a few spirals already. And one of the things I really like, I don't remember where I read this, it's in my notes somewhere, about transferability. Something I was thinking about when I was just preparing this is something I read about action researchers often taking a stance with regard to transferability that says, it's not on the researcher to demonstrate that it's transferable to a setting beyond where the researcher was situated. it's really, you know, how the researcher can possibly know how this might be applicable in other settings. It's the responsibility of the next researcher to look at these and say, oh, you know, cherry pick the things that are applicable. In the action researcher's case, you can cherry pick from your own, in your own work to do it. And again, it's just a matter of being able to say exactly that in a coherent way to whoever your chair is or your committee is, to articulate which aspects are applicable and which ones, of course, aren't going to be, and to write that in your dissertation.
Right, to qualify that with what?
Are you teaching here now?
Yes.
You're teaching in Syracuse?
I'm teaching the special ed program.
Okay.
But
not in this public school.
No, I'm going this summer to go back to the same place where I was in Kenya.
Oh.
To do the pilot.
Oh,
for
great.
research.
Oh, that's
and hopefully go back there the following year
and do your research
longer.
So your research will be
there.
Kenya-based. Wow, that's intense.
Yeah. I'm very curious about this applicability there and this approach.
Now, will you actually be able to start collecting? Where will you be in your process when you go this summer? Will you have?
We have an IRB and we'll be collecting.
Oh, you'll be collecting data, so you'll have at least 2 years to go back.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's great to get that time. Yeah, that's very exciting. And then will you be doing? So that's a large spiral, but you could also. I mean, are you also doing smaller spirals with interventions? You know, trying things out.
Yeah. What we're doing when I was there in Kenya the first time, we were doing introduction to disability studies and what disabilities are and aren't and all of that.
Right.
Work with students and teachers and kind of talk to see where they're at with inclusion and not really anywhere in segregation. And then this time going back and saying, okay, going from where are students with disabilities, are they in classes or not, and moving forward with no cost, so strategies that don't cost any money, not paper, not pencils, more about community building, and starting there. And so introducing that to teachers and then getting a chance to try them.
Yeah.
And then giving feedback and then going on their own.
So where do you position yourself on the spectrum of positionality?
An outsider working with an insider.
Right, that's what I would say too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Neat.
So we're still working through it, and the department's open to it. But I have the idea of the chair. Getting someone who's behind it is.
Yeah.
And we're working through our methodology right now with qualitative and quantitative mixed methods.
Yeah.
That type of stuff too. And probably get your email.
Yeah, great. And I would definitely pick up, at least the dissertation volume, because that's, you might even be able to find that as a PDF online, to tell you the truth. Yeah.
So in the case, kind of like in your situation where you're an outsider helping the insiders, in some cases you'll be leaving that kind of project. How do you, especially if it's clear in your dissertation work that that's going to happen, how do you have to deal with that? Because there's a possibility that you'll leave and it won't continue successfully, and so what have you done? Or do you have to plan ahead for that, of creating steps for how the action is going to continue to address the challenge? Look ahead to these cycles that could come up.
Yeah, it's
you're really
really
focused
important.
on one, but there's still going to be other cycles.
Yeah.
How do you do that in your research and your writing?
Yeah, so can you tell me anything about the work that you might undertake? Do you know?
I'm looking at, because I'm in media studies, at the practices of media organizations in responsibly covering protest movements. So in the future, I'm hoping to get embedded more in a newspaper or some sort of organization, try and develop sort of concrete and responsible practices in just this aspect of reporting.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing would be, so right now you're an outsider to any of that. So the first thing you'd have to do is identify people on the inside who care about the same thing that you care about. You might not find those people. And people who are willing to engage in a process with you that challenges the status quo. So these are all difficult considerations. But let's say all of that happens. The only thing I think that's important is that you are very clear about the boundaries of the research. I had the same situation. By the time I even started the theater project in the city, I was already living up here in Ithaca, and I knew that I was willing. I still had my fellowship at NYU to teach for one more semester, so I had to go down one day a week to the city and teach. So I made that the night of the program, but it was clear that once the program was over, I was not going to continue commuting down to New York on any regular basis to work with these men. So it's just a matter of making sure that you don't, I mean, this is such an easy thing to do in any kind of research, to make promises you can't keep and say, you know, hopefully it's going to lead to this, or it's going to lead to that, and we can do that. And that's just the way that you're going to feel crappy about yourself, and they're going to feel crappy about you. And so I just said that this is the program. This is where it ends. I really hope that we're going to keep in touch, and we have kept in touch over the years. But it was just clear when I'm done this is the end of this work. Unless you know you're staying here in Syracuse or wherever your site's going to be, then you might be able to say, I'm not sure yet, but the likelihood is I might not be here.
I wanted to add a little bit to that too. One of the people, the main person I was collaborating with is a local Kenyan man. He's a local leader in the village where I was staying, and he's also in the Ministry of Education. And so he's employed, but he started working in the schools and then he got promoted to the Ministry of Ed. And he has a really strong view on inclusive education and social justice. And so us working together, he maintains it and creates the trainings and is bringing me back. So he's a really strong factor for that. So I was there 2 summers ago, and we've been in contact planning this next trip since then. And so I do put a lot of emphasis on him maintaining and us collaborating through email. But it's a huge factor, a big strength of me going back, having him on the ground, and being already an insider there.
Yeah.
So that's an ally that I have.
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, you need, if you're doing an outsider with insider action research project, you need insiders who are as invested in the question as you are. Otherwise, you're doing a different kind of research.
The IRB process being a potential hurdle.
Yeah.
So you said their main concern is making sure that the insiders in this context are not harmed. But with the cyclical process where you're constantly interrogating what you're doing, and it would sort of be, it sounds like, disappointing if 3 cycles later you're still kind of doing the same thing. So how can you be sure that you're not going to harm them, or at least persuade an IRB committee if it's understood that this is going to be evolving and you can't say what that's going to be within the scope of the project?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question. I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. I hadn't really. It wasn't asked of me. I mean, I think one. I mean, of course, there are ways to write an IRB proposal that is, you know, you're answering the questions they ask, and you know, the things they ask about harming subjects in this kind of work. I'm riffing here, but I'm just thinking about positionalities, and what I think I might say to address that is that what you're doing would not be so far outside of the scope of what would be expected in a particular setting. Because, you know, one of the questions, as I recall, is there any reason to believe that subjects would be harmed in this work? And I would say no. There's no reason to. You know, you're writing before you start. So at this moment, when I'm submitting this to you, there is no reason to believe that I would do. You know, I mean, you're always going to say, I'm not going to lace those cookies with some sort of narcotic so that the teachers like me more. So yeah, I think you have to answer the question as it's asked. And then, of course, with all research, I mean, you can always be unethical once you get approval. I mean, there are researchers that are unethical, and
please join me in thanking our presenter, Kevin Bott.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you do want to be in touch, my email is kbott